Family Guy has pushed boundaries for over 2 decades, but some episodes went so far that they sparked genuine outrage, got banned from television, or left audiences genuinely uncomfortable. Let's explore the most controversial moments in the show's history and understand what made them so divisive. Partial terms of endearment. The episode too controversial for America. When you think about banned television episodes, you might imagine content so extreme that no network would touch it. But Family Guy's only permanently banned episode in the United States deals with a topic that millions of Americans face every year, yet remains so politically charged that Fox refused to air it even once. This is the story of how an animated comedy about abortion became too hot for American television, while the rest of the world watched it without issue. The episode opens with what seems like a straightforward premise. Lois receives a call from an old college friend named Naomi and someone she hasn't spoken to in years. The reunion starts pleasantly enough, with the two women catching up and reminiscing about their shared past. Naomi and her husband Dale have been trying to have a child for years without success, and they've turned to surrogacy as their last option. After considering their choices, they ask Lois if she would be willing to carry their baby. It's presented as a simple favor between old friends, as something that would give this struggling couple the family they've always wanted. Peter initially opposes the idea, pointing out the obvious difficulties and questioning why Lois would want to go through pregnancy again. But Lois feels a genuine connection to Naomi's situation and believes she can help create something beautiful for people who desperately want to be parents. After some discussion and soul-searching, Peter eventually comes around to supporting his wife's decision. The episode spends considerable time showing Lois going through the medical procedures necessary for surrogacy, establishing that this is a serious commitment she's making out of genuine compassion rather than any selfish motivation. The setup feels relatively tame for Family Guy, tackling a real issue that many families navigate. Surrogacy involves complex emotional, medical, and legal considerations, but the show handles these initial beats with surprising sensitivity, and we see Lois attending doctor appointments, discussing the process with her family, and preparing herself physically and emotionally for carrying someone else's child. There's even a sweetness to how the episode portrays Naomi and Dale's excitement about finally becoming parents through this arrangement. Then comes the turn that transforms this from a thoughtful exploration of surrogacy into the most controversial episode in Family Guy history. And Naomi and Dale are driving home from a celebratory dinner when their car is struck by another vehicle. Both are killed instantly in the accident. In a single moment, the entire premise of Lois's pregnancy is shattered. She's now carrying a baby who has no parents waiting to raise it, no family to welcome it into the world. The biological parents are dead, leaving Lois in an impossible situation that nobody anticipated when they made this arrangement. And the emotional weight of this scenario is genuinely heavy. Lois finds herself pregnant with a child she never intended to raise, carrying a baby for people who no longer exist. The episode doesn't shy away from showing her grief and confusion. She's mourning the death of her friend, while simultaneously grappling with an unexpected moral dilemma that will fundamentally affect her life and her family's future. This is where the episode transitions from dealing with surrogacy to tackling abortion, and where Fox drew a line they refused to let the show cross. Peter and Lois sit down for a series of conversations about what to do next. The show presents both sides of the abortion debate through their discussions, with Peter initially suggesting that terminating the pregnancy might be the most practical solution given their circumstances. They already have 3 children, their family is complete, and this pregnancy was only meant to help someone else build their family, with those intended parents gone. Continuing the pregnancy would mean adding an unplanned fourth child to their household. Lois struggles with this reasoning, feeling a connection to the life growing inside her and remembering her promise to Naomi. The conversations become increasingly complex as they discuss the ethics, emotions, and practical realities of their situation. The episode doesn't present abortion as an easy choice or a simple solution. Instead, it shows two people genuinely wrestling with an impossibly difficult decision that has no clear right answer. The episode includes several cutaway gags that attempt to inject humor into this heavy subject matter, which is standard Family Guy fare. Some of these work better than others, with the show trying to maintain its comedic identity while dealing with serious themes. There are jokes about pregnancy symptoms, about Peter's typical stupidity, and about the family's reactions to Lois's situation. The humor feels strained at times, as if the writers themselves weren't sure how to balance comedy with the gravity of what they're depicting. As Peter and Lois continue debating, the episode brings in different perspectives from other characters. Brian, typically the voice of liberal reason in the show, supports Lois's right to choose whatever she feels is best. Stewie makes darkly comedic comments about the situation from his unique perspective as a baby who talks. Even minor characters weigh in with their opinions, showing how divisive and personal this issue becomes when it affects real people rather than existing as an abstract political debate. The episode culminates in Lois making her decision, though the show handles this in an unusual way. Rather than showing a definitive resolution during the main runtime, the episode cuts to the family sitting around the dinner table weeks later. When someone asks about the pregnancy, Peter turns directly to the camera and flatly states, "We had the abortion," before the episode immediately ends. This fourth wall-breaking moment serves multiple purposes. It acknowledges that this is a television show making a point, rather than trying to present this as realistic drama, and it refuses to dwell on or sensationalize the actual procedure. And this ending infuriated critics on both sides of the abortion debate. Pro-life advocates condemned the episode for treating abortion casually and making light of what they consider taking a life. Pro-choice advocates felt the episode reduced a serious medical decision to a punchline. The show's attempt to handle a controversial topic through its typical irreverent lens satisfied almost nobody. Creating controversy that transcended typical Family Guy outrage. What makes this episode's banning particularly interesting is the context of when it was produced. The episode was created during 2009 and scheduled to air as the finale of Season 8. This was during the Obama administration, a period when cultural conversations about abortion were particularly heated. The episode arrived at Fox executives for approval during a recession when the network was especially sensitive about advertiser relationships and potential boycotts. Our entertainment president Kevin Riley made the decision to ban the episode from American broadcast before Season 8 even premiered. Announcing the decision at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009, Riley defended this choice in interviews, calling abortion an extremely fragile subject matter at an extremely fragile economic time. He specifically noted that of all controversial topics Family Guy had covered, abortion seemed to be the most significant hot-button issue, and the decision wasn't about the quality of the episode or even necessarily about moral objections to its content. It was a business calculation that broadcasting this episode could cause trouble that simply wasn't worth the risk. The international response to this ban proves fascinating when you consider how different countries treated the same content. BBC Three aired the episode in the United Kingdom on June 20th, 2010. During its regular primetime slot at 10:30 p.m., over 1 million British households watched the episode, and it received generally positive reviews from critics who praised it for tackling a difficult subject. Other countries that aired the episode included Canada, Australia, and various European nations, none of which found the content too controversial for broadcast. This discrepancy highlights the unique relationship Americans have with abortion as a cultural and political issue, on what much of the world viewed as a television show addressing a medical procedure that exists in reality. American networks treated as content too dangerous to allow on air. The episode remains legally available in the United States only through the Season 8 DVD box set, creating the strange situation where Americans can buy it, but can't watch it on television. The actual content of the episode, when viewed objectively, and isn't particularly more shocking than other Family Guy episodes that aired without controversy. The show has featured jokes about nearly every sensitive topic imaginable, from terrorism to child abuse to sexual assault. The difference is that abortion exists as an ongoing political battleground in America in ways these other topics don't. The episode's treatment of abortion wasn't notably more graphic, offensive, or disrespectful than the show's treatment of other serious subjects, but it touched on something that remains legally and politically contested in ways that made it uniquely problematic for American broadcast. Seth MacFarlane himself has noted that he found the ban disappointing, arguing that the episode presented both perspectives on abortion fairly and didn't advocate for one position over the other. From his perspective, the show was simply dramatizing a situation where abortion becomes a consideration and showing how difficult that choice can be. And the fact that Lois and Peter are in an unusual circumstance, carrying a baby for deceased parents, actually makes their situation less applicable to typical abortion debates, while still exploring the emotional complexity involved. Critics of the ban point out the hypocrisy of allowing Family Guy to make jokes about virtually anything else while drawing the line at abortion. The show has featured storylines about child molestation, depicted graphic violence, made light of tragic deaths, and included countless sexually explicit jokes. Drawing the line specifically at a thoughtful discussion of abortion while allowing these other topics suggests that American television is more comfortable with shocking content than with genuine political controversy. The episode's legacy extends beyond its banned status. It became a rallying point for discussions about censorship, about what topics television can and cannot address, and about whether comedy has a responsibility to avoid certain subjects entirely. The fact that this single episode remains banned over a decade later, while the show has aired hundreds of other episodes, demonstrates that some topics remain off-limits in ways others don't. The practical impact of the ban is that millions of Americans who watch Family Guy regularly have never seen this episode and may not even know it exists. Unlike other controversial episodes that aired once before being pulled from reruns, this episode never received a single American broadcast. Its existence is known primarily to dedicated fans who either purchased the DVD set or found the episode through other means. This creates an unusual gap in the show's catalogue, a missing piece that represents the one boundary Fox wouldn't let the show cross. Looking at the episode today, in which treatment of abortion seems relatively measured compared to how polarized the national conversation has become, the episode doesn't advocate strongly for either pro-life or pro-choice positions. instead presenting abortion as a difficult personal decision that people might make in extraordinary circumstances. This nuanced approach, ironically, might have been part of the problem. By not taking a clear stance, the episode risked offending everyone, rather than satisfying anyone. The banned status of this episode also raises questions about the future of controversial content on television. As streaming platforms have become more prominent and traditional broadcast standards have loosened in some ways, would this episode still be banned if produced today? Or has the political climate around abortion become even more charged, making it less likely than ever to receive approval? The fact that recent years have seen increased restrictions on abortion access in many states suggests the topic has become more rather than less controversial since 2009. For Family Guy itself, the banned episode represents both a badge of honor and a reminder of limitations. The show has always prided itself on pushing boundaries and refusing to acknowledge topics as off-limits. Having an episode banned entirely demonstrates that those boundaries do exist, and no matter how aggressively the show tries to challenge them. At the same time, the ban validates the show's reputation as genuinely controversial, rather than just edgy within safe parameters. The episode's treatment of surrogacy, which gets overshadowed by the abortion controversy, actually deserves recognition for portraying a real process that many families navigate. Before the tragic accident, the episode showed surrogacy as a generous act that requires serious medical and emotional commitment. It depicted the legal arrangements, the medical procedures, and the relationships between surrogate and intended parents with reasonable accuracy. This aspect of the episode demonstrates that Family Guy can handle serious topics with some sensitivity when it chooses to do so. The ban also affected the DVD release strategy for Season 8. Rather than simply excluding the controversial episode, the Season 8 box set includes it as the intended finale, allowing fans to watch the season in its originally planned order. This decision suggests that even if Fox wouldn't broadcast the episode, they recognized it as legitimate content that deserved to be available to audiences who specifically sought it out. International audiences watching this episode without the American cultural context around abortion might find the controversy difficult to understand. Said the episode presents a specific scenario, shows characters debating their options, and concludes with them making a choice. For viewers in countries where abortion access is less politically contentious, this might seem like a reasonable way to address the topic in an adult animated comedy. The fact that American networks found it unacceptable reveals more about American culture than about the episode itself. The episode serves as a time capsule of 2009's political climate, and when the Obama administration was newly elected, and cultural battles over abortion were particularly fierce. Network television was still the dominant medium for reaching mass audiences, making broadcast decisions more significant than they would be in today's fragmented streaming landscape. The economic recession meant networks were particularly sensitive to anything that might trigger advertiser boycotts or viewer backlash that could affect their bottom line. Seth MacFarlane's response to the controversy has evolved over time. While initially defending the episode as balanced and fair, he's also acknowledged that perhaps expecting American television to broadcast nuanced abortion content was unrealistic given the political environment. This doesn't mean he regrets making the episode, but rather that he understands why it became untouchable for network executives who had to consider factors beyond creative content. The banned status has also given the episode a mythological quality among fans. Because it's not easily accessible, it's become something people seek out specifically to see what was deemed too controversial. This forbidden fruit aspect means the episode gets more attention than it might have received if it had simply aired and faded into the show's extensive catalogue. The controversy itself became more significant than the actual content. Looking at the episode's place in television history, it represents a rare instance where American broadcast networks drew a definitive line. While cable networks have more freedom with content, broadcast networks like Fox remain subject to FCC regulations and advertiser pressures that make controversial content riskier. The decision to ban this specific episode sent a clear message about what topics remain genuinely off-limits regardless of how they were handled. The aftermath of the ban didn't significantly impact Family Guy's success or willingness to push boundaries. The show continued making controversial episodes, joking about sensitive topics, and generating occasional outrage from various groups. But none of these subsequent controversial episodes got banned, suggesting that abortion specifically occupied a unique place in the hierarchy of untouchable subjects. And this episode's legacy is complicated because it represents both a failure and a success for the show. It failed to reach its intended broadcast audience and got banned for addressing a topic the network deemed too controversial. But it succeeded in proving that Family Guy was willing to tackle genuinely difficult subjects rather than just making shock value jokes about safe targets. The episode exists in a strange limbo, officially part of the show's canon, but practically absent from most viewers' experience. The question of whether the ban was justified depends largely on your perspective about television's role in addressing controversial topics. If you believe broadcast networks should avoid inflaming political divisions over issues that remain legally and culturally contested, then the ban makes sense as a practical business decision. And if you believe comedy has a responsibility to address difficult topics, and that censoring abortion content treats women's medical decisions as uniquely shameful, then the ban represents cowardice masked as prudence. What's undeniable is that this episode, more than any other in Family Guy's history, revealed the limits of what American television will accept. The show had pushed boundaries countless times before, but this was the boundary that pushed back. Over a decade later, the episode remains banned, a testament to abortion's unique status as a topic that transcends typical controversies and touches on something American culture still can't discuss without intense division. Screams of silence, the domestic violence episode that missed the mark. When Family Guy decided to tackle domestic violence in a serious manner, the result was an episode so controversial and poorly received that it became a case study in how not to address serious issues through comedy. And this wasn't controversial because it made offensive jokes about a sensitive topic. It was controversial because it tried to be genuine and serious, while fundamentally misunderstanding the issue it was attempting to address, creating something that offended viewers, advocates, and critics alike. The episode begins with a typically absurd Family Guy setup involving quagmire and autoerotic asphyxiation. Peter and Joe find their friend hanging from his ceiling, they initially believing he's dead from a sex act gone wrong. This opening establishes the episode's tonal confusion right from the start. It wants to be funny and irreverent like normal Family Guy, but it's about to pivot into a serious examination of domestic abuse that doesn't work with this comedic foundation. While Quagmire recovers in the hospital, his sister Brenda arrives with her boyfriend Jeff. We'd seen these characters briefly in an earlier episode where their abusive dynamic was played for dark humor, with Brian making jokes about how Brenda looks like she likes it rough. That earlier appearance treated domestic violence as a punchline, establishing these characters as sources of dark comedy rather than subjects for serious drama. This episode attempts to course correct by taking the situation seriously, but the shift feels jarring and inconsistent with how the show previously handled these exact same characters. The first signs that something is wrong with Brenda and Jeff's relationship come quickly. Jeff speaks to Brenda with obvious contempt, putting her down in subtle ways that gradually escalate. The episode shows him controlling her behavior, making her feel small, and creating an atmosphere of fear around their relationship. And these early scenes actually demonstrate some understanding of how emotional abuse works, showing the psychological manipulation that often accompanies physical violence. But then the episode makes a crucial mistake that undermines everything else it tries to do. Jeff starts physically abusing Brenda in public, in front of other characters, in ways that are impossible to miss or misinterpret. He hits her at Quagmire's house while everyone is around. He screams at her loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. He leaves visible bruises and black eyes that Brenda wears in broad daylight. This public nature of the abuse contradicts how domestic violence typically operates and creates the central problem that makes the rest of the episode's message so problematic. In reality, domestic abusers typically maintain a public persona that seems normal or even charming, while reserving their abusive behavior for private moments where there are no witnesses. They rely on victims being too afraid or ashamed to report the abuse, knowing that without evidence or testimony, they can maintain plausible deniability. Jeff's behavior in this episode is the opposite of this pattern. He's openly violent in front of multiple witnesses, including a police officer. Yet the episode insists that nothing can be done until Brenda files a complaint. This leads to one of the episode's most criticized moments. Joe Swanson, a police officer, tells Quagmire that he cannot arrest Jeff unless Brenda files a formal complaint against him. This directly contradicts Rhode Island law, which mandates that police must make an arrest in domestic violence situations when they have probable cause, regardless of whether the victim cooperates. The law exists specifically because domestic violence victims often feel unable to report their abusers due to fear, manipulation, or financial dependence. By stating that nothing can be done without Brenda's complaint, the episode spreads dangerous misinformation about legal protections that actually exist for abuse victims. The episode then shows Quagmire and the Griffins staging an intervention for Brenda, and they gather her family and friends to tell her that she needs to leave Jeff and that everyone sees what's happening in her relationship. The intervention includes some genuinely emotional moments, particularly when Quagmire gives a heartfelt speech about how much he loves his sister and wants her to be safe. These scenes demonstrate that the writers understood the emotional stakes involved in trying to help someone leave an abusive relationship. But then, Quagmire's speech takes a turn that completely derails whatever goodwill the episode had built. He tells Brenda that if she stays with Jeff, she doesn't deserve to be called a woman. He essentially tells his sister that remaining in an abusive relationship makes her less than human, that abuse victims who don't immediately leave their abusers are choosing to be victimized. This is victim blaming of the most blatant kind, suggesting that Brenda is at fault for Jeff's behavior because she hasn't left yet. This completely misunderstands the psychology of domestic violence. Victims stay in abusive relationships for countless reasons, including financial dependence, fear of the abuser escalating violence if they try to leave, concerns about children, religious beliefs, lack of support systems, or the psychological damage caused by extended abuse that makes it difficult to see a way out. The episode acknowledges none of these complexities, instead presenting Brenda's situation as a simple choice between staying and leaving, as if abuse victims just need someone to tell them the relationship is bad before they can walk away. Jeff then interrupts the intervention with news that makes everything worse. Brenda is pregnant, and they're getting married. This development adds another layer to an already complicated situation, but the episode treats it primarily as an obstacle to the solution the characters have already decided on. The pregnancy isn't explored for its actual implications about bringing a child into an abusive home, or about how pregnancy often escalates abuse because victims become more dependent on their abusers. Instead, it's just another reason why Brenda won't leave Jeff immediately. After the intervention fails, Peter, Quagmire, and Joe decide that the only solution is to murder Jeff. They discuss this plan openly, with Joe, a police officer, not only agreeing to participate, but actively helping plan the killing. The episode wants us to see this as justified vigilante justice, as men protecting a woman who can't protect herself from a monster who deserves to die. But this solution completely undermines any serious message about addressing domestic violence. The murder plot plays out like a dark comedy thriller, with the three men luring Jeff into the woods on a fake hunting trip. Jeff figures out what's happening and manages to overpower them, leading to a physical confrontation where he beats Quagmire nearly to death. During this fight, the episode shows Jeff's violence in ways that should prove the men were justified in trying to kill him. He's presented as so irredeemably evil that murder is the only reasonable response. Quagmire ultimately kills Jeff by running him over with a car, crushing him against a tree. The men then forge a note from Jeff saying he decided to leave Brenda and move on with his life. They present this note to Brenda, who breaks down crying over Jeff abandoning her, still believing she loved him despite everything he did to her. The episode ends with Brenda mourning her abuser, while the men celebrate having solved her problem without her knowledge or consent. This resolution is deeply problematic on multiple levels. First, it suggests that murder is an appropriate response to domestic violence, rather than using legal interventions, support services, and helping victims develop safety plans to leave safely. Second, it removes all agency from Brenda, having men decide what's best for her and taking violent action without her input. Third, it doesn't address the psychological damage Brenda has suffered or help her recover from abuse. It just removes the immediate threat without doing anything to help her heal or prevent her from entering another abusive relationship in the future. The episode tries to justify this ending by showing that Brenda is devastated by Jeff's apparent abandonment, suggesting she would have stayed with him forever if the men hadn't intervened. But this actually proves the episode's fundamental misunderstanding of domestic violence. Brenda's reaction to Jeff leaving shows she's experiencing the trauma bond that forms between abuse victims and their abusers. She needs therapy and support to break this psychological pattern, not for her abuser to be secretly murdered by male relatives who think they know what's best for her. The critical response to this episode was overwhelmingly negative. Our reviewers noted that the episode wanted to make a serious statement about domestic violence while simultaneously treating it as plot device for a dark comedy about murder. The AV Club gave it a D+ grade, with reviewer Kevin McFarlane writing that a serious episode of Family Guy cripples the show's strengths. He noted that shifting to a dramatic bottle episode this late in the show's run felt far too little too late, and that nobody cares about the Griffin family members the way audiences care about characters in shows that have earned emotional investment from viewers. Domestic violence advocates were particularly harsh in their criticism. Organizations that work with abuse survivors pointed out the dangerous misinformation the episode spread about legal protections, the victim blaming embedded in Quagmire's speech, and the problematic message that violence is the solution to violence. And some advocates worried that abuse victims watching the episode might internalize the message that they don't deserve to be called women if they don't immediately leave their abusers, adding to the shame and self-blame that already makes leaving so difficult. The episode's portrayal of Jeff as an obviously evil monster who abuses Brenda publicly also drew criticism for being unrealistic. Real abusers often appear charming and normal to outsiders, which is why abuse victims frequently struggle to get people to believe them when they finally do speak up. By making Jeff so transparently terrible that everyone can see he's abusive, the episode fails to capture how difficult it is to recognize and address domestic violence when it's happening to someone you know. The show's attempt to balance comedy with serious drama created tonal whiplash that satisfied nobody. The episode includes cutaway gags and comedic moments that feel completely inappropriate given the subject matter. There's a musical number parodying Rock Lobster called Iraq Lobster that has nothing to do with the main plot and seems to exist just because the show needed to maintain its comedic identity. These moments of levity clash with scenes of Brenda being beaten and emotionally destroyed, creating a viewing experience that doesn't work as either comedy or drama. What makes this episode particularly frustrating is that it had the potential to do something meaningful. Family Guy reaches millions of viewers, many of whom might be experiencing domestic violence themselves or know someone who is. An episode that accurately portrayed the dynamics of abusive relationships, showed legal and social resources that actually exist, and depicted a realistic path to leaving safely could have provided valuable information disguised as entertainment. Instead, the episode spreads misinformation and reinforces harmful stereotypes about domestic violence. The episode also raised questions about whether Family Guy, specifically, was the right vehicle for addressing this topic seriously. The show had spent years making jokes about abuse, treating violence against women as comedy, and creating characters whose entire personalities revolved around being terrible people. Meg gets abused by her family constantly, played entirely for laughs. A quagmire is a sex predator whose behavior is portrayed as funny rather than criminal. Peter regularly commits acts of violence against Lois and others without consequences. For a show with this history, to suddenly try treating domestic violence seriously required a massive tonal shift that the episode couldn't successfully execute. Some defenders of the episode argued that it deserves credit for at least attempting to address a serious issue, even if the execution was flawed. They pointed to Quagmire's emotional speech and the episode's acknowledgement that domestic violence exists and causes real harm. However, these defenders typically had to concede that the episode's problems undermined whatever positive intentions might have existed behind it. The episode's legacy is that it's frequently cited as an example of Family Guy at its worst, when it tries to be serious and meaningful while maintaining its irreverent comedy style. The mix doesn't work, leaving viewers with an episode that fails as both comedy and social commentary. It's become a cautionary tale about the dangers of trying to tackle serious issues through a comedic lens without fully understanding those issues or committing to treating them with appropriate gravity. Years later, a director's cut of the episode aired that attempted to address some criticisms by making Jeff's abuse more subtle and less obviously public, and this revised version tried to fix the problem of everyone being able to see the abuse by making Jeff act more appropriately in public while being abusive in private. However, this created new problems because the plot still required everyone to know about the abuse in order to stage the intervention and plan the murder. The director's cut couldn't fix the fundamental structural problems with the story, and the episode also prompted discussions about whether comedy shows should address serious issues at all, or whether doing so inherently trivializes those issues. Some argued that any attempt to mix domestic violence with comedy is disrespectful to survivors and makes light of serious trauma. Others maintained that comedy can address difficult topics if done thoughtfully, but that this particular episode demonstrated how not to do it. For domestic violence advocates, the episode became an example to point to when discussing how media portrayal of abuse affects public understanding. They used it in training sessions and educational materials to show how media can reinforce dangerous misconceptions about abuse, victim blaming, and legal protections. In this sense, the episode had educational value, but not in the way its creators intended. And the episode's treatment of Brenda as a character is particularly problematic because she's given almost no agency or depth. She exists primarily as a victim for the men to rescue, rather than as a fully realized person with her own thoughts, feelings, and capacity to make decisions about her life. The episode is nominally about her situation, but it's really about Quagmire's feelings about his sister being abused and about the men taking action to solve a problem. Brenda herself barely gets to speak about what she wants or needs. The murderer's solution ending is especially disturbing because it suggests that domestic violence can be solved through more violence, just violence directed at the abuser instead of the victim. This completely ignores the legal, social, and therapeutic interventions that actually help abuse victims leave safely and rebuild their lives. It also ignores the reality that many abuse victims might not want their abusers dead, and even as they recognize the relationship is harmful. They might want the abuse to stop while maintaining the relationship, or they might want to leave without causing harm to anyone. The episode doesn't allow for this complexity. Looking back at this episode from years later, it stands as one of Family Guy's most misguided attempts at social commentary. The show had proven it could occasionally say something meaningful while maintaining its comedic voice. But this episode demonstrates how badly that balance can fail when the topic requires more sensitivity and understanding than the creators possessed. It's an episode that probably shouldn't have been made, or at least should have been made with extensive consultation from domestic violence experts and abuse survivors who could have helped avoid the most egregious problems. And the fact that this episode aired during the same season as other controversial episodes suggests that the show was in a period where it was trying to push boundaries and address serious topics more frequently. But the backlash to this particular episode may have influenced the show's approach going forward, making creators more cautious about trying to be serious when the audience comes to Family Guy expecting comedy rather than social commentary. Quagmire's Dad, the transgender episode that divided audiences. In 2010, Family Guy aired an episode that attempted to address transgender identity and gender-affirming surgery through its typical irreverent lens. The result was deeply divisive, praised by some for including transgender representation on a mainstream animated show, while condemned by others for its portrayal being insensitive, inaccurate, and ultimately transphobic. The controversy surrounding this episode has only intensified over the years as society's understanding of transgender issues has evolved, and the episode's treatment of its transgender character has aged increasingly poorly. The episode opens with Quagmire announcing that his father is coming to visit. We've never met Quagmire's father before, and Quagmire describes him as a war hero, a Navy lieutenant commander who served in Vietnam and inspired Quagmire to become the person he is today. There's genuine affection in how Quagmire talks about his father, establishing a close relationship that will be tested by the revelations to come. when Lieutenant Commander Dan Quagmire arrives. Peter and Joe immediately notice something off about his demeanor and behavior. He displays what they interpret as effeminate mannerisms, tells boring stories about his military service that don't match the exciting tales Quagmire has shared, and generally seems different from what they expected. And Peter and Joe quickly conclude that Quagmire's father must be gay, whispering about this to each other while Quagmire remains oblivious. This setup relies on stereotypes about how gay men behave and treats homosexuality as something to gossip about behind someone's back. The episode continues building toward its central revelation through a series of scenes where Dan's behavior becomes increasingly difficult for Peter and Joe to ignore. At a Navy ball honoring Dan's military service, our other sailors make suggestive comments and double entendres about him that suggest they know something Quagmire doesn't. These scenes are uncomfortable because they treat Dan's identity as an open secret that everyone is laughing about except Quagmire, creating a sense that there's something embarrassing or shameful about whatever Dan is hiding. The big reveal comes when Dan finally tells Quagmire the truth. Dan isn't gay. Dan is transgender. She's a woman who has been living in a male body her entire life, and she's decided to undergo gender-affirming surgery to bring her body in line with her identity. She's changing her name to Ida and wants Quagmire to accept and support her through this transition. Quagmire's initial reaction is complicated. He doesn't understand what his father is telling him, initially thinking it would be simpler if Dan was just gay. This confusion is presented as comedy, armed with Quagmire's ignorance about transgender identity, used as the basis for jokes. This misunderstanding reveals one of the episode's central problems. It conflates sexual orientation with gender identity, treating them as variations of the same thing, rather than distinct aspects of human identity. The episode suggests that being transgender is somehow more complicated or harder to accept than being gay, playing into stereotypes about transgender people being confused or mentally ill, and this conflation persists throughout the episode, with characters continuing to struggle with the difference between someone being gay and someone being transgender. The process of Ida's transition is handled in ways that transgender advocates found deeply problematic. The episode shows Dan walking into a hospital as a man and walking out a few hours later as Ida, fully transitioned with no recovery period, no hormone therapy beforehand, and no realistic depiction of what gender-affirming surgery actually involves. Ida emerges from surgery wearing high heels and a tight dress, immediately presenting as hyperfeminine in ways that reinforce stereotypes about transgender women, just wanting to be sexy rather than seeking alignment between their gender identity and physical body. In reality, gender-affirming surgery is a complex process that requires extensive preparation, multiple procedures, and months of recovery. Transgender people typically spend years on hormone therapy before being eligible for surgery. The recovery period from genital reconstruction surgery alone involves weeks of limited mobility and months before resuming normal activities. By showing Ida's transition as instant and effortless, the episode misrepresents what transgender people actually experience and makes the process seem trivial or cosmetic, rather than medically necessary for many transgender individuals' well-being. The episode's B-plot involves Brian being out of town at a seminar, missing all the revelations about Ida's transition. When he returns to Quahog, he meets Ida at a hotel bar without knowing her history. They hit it off, with Brian being genuinely attracted to this woman he's just met. They spend the night together, with the episode implying they have sex. This setup creates dramatic irony where the audience knows something Brian doesn't, as setting up what the episode treats as the ultimate punchline. When Brian returns to the Griffin house the next morning, he's excited about meeting someone who might be special. He tells Stewie about this amazing woman he connected with, describing her as beautiful and charming. Stewie then tells Brian about Quagmire's father's transition, not initially realizing that the woman Brian is describing is Ida. When Brian pieces together that he slept with a transgender woman, his reaction is played as the most horrified possible response. Brian's reaction is what makes this episode genuinely transphobic, rather than just poorly informed. He immediately refers to Ida using the pronoun it, rather than she, dehumanizing her by treating her gender identity as invalid. He launches into an extended vomiting sequence that lasts approximately 30 seconds, one of the longest continuous gags in Family Guy history. The vomiting is presented as a natural and appropriate response to discovering you've had sex with a transgender woman, suggesting that transgender women's bodies are inherently disgusting, or that having sex with a transgender woman is something that should make a person physically ill. The episode tries to justify Brian's reaction through his dialogue about how transgender women should be required to disclose their transgender status before having sex with someone. He compares transgender people to sex offenders, saying they should have to notify people the way registered sex offenders notify their neighborhoods. This comparison is both offensive and dangerous, equating transgender identity with criminal behavior and suggesting that transgender people who don't immediately disclose their status are deceiving or violating their partners. This narrative around disclosure ignores the very real violence that transgender women face when they reveal their transgender status to potential partners. Transgender women, particularly transgender women of color, face alarming rates of violence and murder from men who feel deceived or threatened by learning their partner is transgender. The trans panic defense has been used in court to justify violence against transgender people by claiming that discovering someone is transgender is provocation enough to excuse assault or murder. By suggesting that Brian's horror is justified and that Ida should have disclosed her status immediately, the episode reinforces the very attitudes that put transgender people at risk. The episode's treatment of Lois's reaction to Ida adds another layer of problematic content. Lois repeatedly refers to Ida using male pronouns and makes comments suggesting she doesn't view Ida as a real woman. When the family discusses Ida, Lois describes her as Quagmire's he-she father-mother, refusing to acknowledge Ida's gender identity. Peter and Lois treat Ida's transition as a joke and actively mock her behind her back, with the show presenting this behavior as normal rather than transphobic. The climax of the episode comes when Quagmire discovers that Brian slept with Ida. Quagmire reacts with rage, hunting down Brian and beating him severely. The episode presents this violence as justified, showing Brian getting exactly what he deserves for having sex with Quagmire's transgender parent. The fight is brutal, with Quagmire throwing Brian downstairs and hitting him repeatedly while Brian tries to escape. When the beating ends, Brian gets the last word by telling Quagmire, I fucked your dad, using male pronouns to refer to Ida and deliberately misgendering her as a final insult before slamming the door in Quagmire's face. This ending undermines any claim the episode might make about being sympathetic to transgender people. Brian's final line makes it clear that he views Ida as a man, regardless of her transition, and the episode treats this as an effective comeback rather than a cruel rejection of Ida's identity. The joke is that Brian had sex with a man, not with a woman, reinforcing the transphobic idea that transgender women are really just men in dresses. Seth MacFarlane defended the episode in interviews, stating that he was surprised by the negative reaction and felt Ida was portrayed sympathetically. He argued that Brian's vomiting reaction was appropriate because Brian is heterosexual, and discovering he had unknowingly had sex with someone who had male anatomy would naturally be upsetting to him. And MacFarlane compared it to a gay man discovering he'd had sex with someone with a vagina, suggesting the disgust would be equivalent. This defense demonstrates fundamental misunderstanding of transgender issues and why the episode was offensive. Transgender women are women regardless of their anatomy or surgical status. Brian's reaction wasn't about discovering unexpected anatomy. It was about discovering his partner was transgender and treating that fact as disgusting. If the episode had shown Brian being surprised but ultimately accepting of Ida as a woman he was attracted to, the reaction might have been different. Instead, it showed Brian rejecting Ida's gender identity entirely and treating having been intimate with her as a source of shame and horror. The Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, GLAAD, issued a statement criticizing the episode for its portrayal of transgender identity and the violence it depicted against its transgender character. And while the physical violence came from Quagmire, rather than directed at Ida specifically, GLAAD noted that the entire episode treated transgender identity as something shameful and disgusting, potentially reinforcing attitudes that lead to real violence against transgender people. The Parents Television Council, usually critical of Family Guy for different reasons, it also named this episode the worst TV show of the week. They objected to what they characterized as stereotyped portrayal of transgender identity, along with the episode's sexual content and violence. The fact that both liberal advocacy groups and conservative media watchdogs found the episode problematic suggests it failed on multiple levels. What makes this episode particularly disappointing is that 2010 was actually a period when television was beginning to portray transgender characters more thoughtfully. The same year this episode aired, the Canadian teen drama Degrassi introduced Adam Torres, one of television's first transgender teenage main characters. Other shows were starting to include transgender characters who were portrayed with dignity and whose stories focused on their humanity rather than treating their transgender identity as a punchline. Family Guy could have contributed to this growing representation, but instead produced an episode that felt regressive even by 2010 standards. The episode's treatment of the surgery itself adds insult to injury. Ida casually discusses her genitalia at a family dinner, browses porn on her phone in public, and generally behaves in hypersexual ways that reinforce stereotypes about transgender women being sexually inappropriate. These characterization choices suggest that the writers viewed Ida primarily as a sexual being, rather than as a complete person with identity, feelings, and experiences beyond her transition and sexuality. The episode also missed opportunities to educate viewers about transgender issues in ways that wouldn't have compromised the comedy. A brief conversation where someone explains the difference between sexual orientation and gender identity could have helped confused viewers. Showing Ida's transition as the lengthy process it actually is might have helped viewers understand the seriousness and medical necessity of gender-affirming care. Having any character defend Ida's identity and call out the transphobic behavior of others could have provided a moral center that the episode desperately needed. Instead, the episode treats every character who accepts Ida as either foolish or sexually perverted. Quagmire eventually accepts his parents' transition, but the final scene shows him getting an erection around Ida while saying his anatomy can't tell the difference between Ida and a cisgender woman. This treats Quagmire's acceptance as a sexual aberration rather than as appropriate respect for his parents' gender identity. And the episode's legacy is that Ida became a recurring character who continued to appear in later episodes, almost always as the subject of transphobic jokes. In one later episode, she donates her removed penis to Quagmire after a shark bites off his genitals. In another, she uses being transgender as an excuse for inappropriate behavior, reinforcing stereotypes about transgender people exploiting their identity for special treatment. Each subsequent appearance compounds the problems of the original episode by continuing to treat Ida as a punchline rather than as a person. Years later, as society's understanding and acceptance of transgender people has increased, this episode has aged worse rather than better. What might have seemed like edgy comedy in 2010 now looks like blatant transphobia that contributed to harmful stereotypes about transgender people. The episode serves as an example of how comedy can cause real harm when it punches down at marginalized groups rather than challenging prejudice and intolerance. The most damning aspect of this episode is that it had the potential to do something meaningful. Family Guy reaches millions of viewers, many of whom might never knowingly meet a transgender person. And an episode introducing a transgender character could have humanized transgender people and helped audiences understand gender identity as something real and valid, rather than as a joke or a mental illness. Instead, the episode reinforced every negative stereotype about transgender people and suggested that disgust and rejection are appropriate responses to learning someone is transgender. For transgender viewers, especially those who were struggling with their identity in 2010, this episode sent a clear message that society views them as disgusting and shameful. Seeing Brian's extended vomiting reaction played for laughs communicated that this is how people will react if they find out you're transgender. The episode's treatment of Ida as less than a real woman suggested that transition doesn't actually change your gender in ways others will recognize or respect. These messages can be genuinely harmful to transgender people's mental health and sense of self-worth. The episode also demonstrates how problematic it is to attempt to speak for marginalized communities without including their voices in the creative process. There's no evidence that transgender people were consulted during the writing or production of this episode. The portrayal of transition, the characters' reactions, and the jokes all suggest that the writers relied on stereotypes and assumptions rather than actual knowledge about transgender experiences. Including transgender writers and consultants might have helped the show avoid the most egregious problems. Looking at this episode in 2026, after years of increased visibility and activism around transgender rights, it's remarkable that it remains available on streaming platforms without content warnings or context. The episode continues to reach new viewers who might not have the knowledge to recognize its harmful content, potentially reinforcing transphobic attitudes in each new generation that discovers Family Guy. The fact that the show has never really acknowledged the problems with this episode or apologized for its portrayal suggests that the creators still don't fully understand why it was harmful. The controversy around this episode raises broader questions about representation and responsibility in media. When you include a character from a marginalized group, and especially a group as frequently stigmatized and misunderstood as transgender people, you have a responsibility to portray them with some level of accuracy and dignity. Comedy doesn't require cruelty, and jokes don't have to come at the expense of vulnerable people's humanity. This episode failed to meet that basic standard of ethical storytelling. Seahorse Seashell Party. When Meg finally fought back. During a hurricane that traps the Griffin family in their house, a Family Guy aired an episode that seemed poised to finally address the years of abuse Meg has endured from her family. For about 15 minutes, the episode delivered the most cathartic content in the show's history, with Meg systematically tearing down each family member who had spent years treating her as a verbal and emotional punching bag. But then came an ending so thoroughly disappointing that it retroactively ruined everything the episode seemed to be building toward, leaving viewers with a message that abuse victims should accept their abuse for the greater good. The episode begins with the power going out during a hurricane, leaving the Griffins stuck inside with nothing to do. This setup creates a bottle episode where the family has to actually interact with each other without the distractions of television or separate activities. The confined space and forced proximity create pressure that will eventually lead to an explosion of honest communication, although not in ways anyone expects. While the family dynamics play out downstairs, Brian discovers psychedelic mushrooms and decides to eat them, leading to an extended hallucinogenic sequence that runs parallel to the main plot. Brian's trip involves disturbing imagery, creepy crawling sensations, and him cutting off his own ear in a moment of drug-induced panic. Stewie has to care for Brian through this ordeal, stitching his ear back on and trying to keep him calm, while Brian experiences what appears to be a genuinely bad trip. This B-plot serves multiple purposes, providing comic relief from the heavy family drama, while also keeping Brian functionally out of the main story, so he can't serve as the voice of reason he typically embodies. The trip sequence itself is impressively animated, with the show experimenting with different visual styles to represent Brian's altered perception. Our references to Van Gogh and other artistic inspirations create surreal imagery that feels genuinely unsettling rather than just funny. However, this subplot also highlights one of the episode's main problems. The show can't fully commit to the serious drama of the A-plot, so it includes this extended drug trip as safety valve in case audiences get too uncomfortable with the family confrontation. The real drama begins when Peter starts humming the theme from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. He continues this humming for what feels like an eternity, filling the silence with an annoying tune that gradually grates on everyone's nerves. When Meg opens a can of soda, the pop sound interrupts Peter's humming, and he snaps at her for making noise. This seemingly minor moment becomes the spark that ignites Meg's years of accumulated rage. Meg starts quietly at first, pointing out the hypocrisy of Peter complaining about her noise when he's been humming obnoxiously for who knows how long. But as she continues speaking, her voice grows stronger and her criticisms more pointed. She's not just defending herself against this single instance of unfair treatment. She's finally expressing everything she's felt about how her family treats her on a daily basis. Chris tries to defend Peter, claiming he found the humming entertaining. Meg immediately turns on her brother, asking why he's always so cruel to her. She points out that Chris, who should be her ally as a fellow teenager dealing with their family's dysfunction, instead joins in bullying her. She calls him a fat, zitty loser who has no friends and smells like an old woman with pet birds. These aren't random insults. They're her throwing back the kind of things Chris has said to her, showing him what it feels like to be on the receiving end. The confrontation escalates when Meg turns to Lois. This is where the episode gets genuinely interesting, because Meg doesn't just list her complaints about her mother. She systematically deconstructs Lois's entire identity and shows how Lois's past behavior undermines any moral authority she might claim. Meg brings up Lois's history as a shoplifter, drug addict, porn star, and serial cheater who slept with Gene Simmons, Bill Clinton, and others while married to Peter. Each revelation is something viewers know from previous episodes, but hearing them listed together in Meg's angry voice recontextualizes Lois's judgment of Meg as hypocritical. Lois tries to defend herself by saying those experiences made her a better person. Meg shoots this down immediately, asking if Lois is actually better. Is she a good mother? Is she a good person? The answer, left hanging in the air, seems to be no. Meg points out that Lois was supposed to protect her, guide her, help her navigate becoming a person. Instead, Lois has been the ringleader of the family's cruelty toward her, teaching Chris and Peter by example that Meg exists to be insulted and dismissed. When Meg tells Lois that she's seriously considering cutting off all contact with the family once she turns 18, it's a genuinely heartbreaking moment. This isn't a teenage tantrum or empty threat. It's a young woman recognizing that her family is toxic and planning her escape. Lois breaks down crying, apologizing and begging forgiveness, and which shows that Meg's words have genuinely hurt her. The episode seems to be building toward Lois having an epiphany about how she's treated her daughter. But Peter, true to form, can't read the room and makes a joke about the whole situation. This gives Meg the opening to turn her attention to her father, and this is where her speech becomes most devastating. She tells Peter he has no education, no interests, and no impulse control. He does whatever reckless thing he wants without thinking about consequences. She brings up specific episodes where Peter's selfishness nearly destroyed the family, terrorized the community, or hurt innocent people. She calls him a fat, lazy, abusive alcoholic who barely makes enough to support his family and has nothing to show for having lived half his life. The centerpiece of Meg's attack on Peter is when she tells him his only arguable accomplishments are his kids, and then points out that his kids are a disaster. She forces Peter to confront the fact that his parenting has fundamentally failed. Chris is struggling. Meg is a mess. Even Stewie, the genius baby, protests when Meg includes him in this assessment. She tells Peter he's a complete embarrassment in every possible way, and ends by calling him a waste of a man. This moment is remarkable because it's not just Meg venting. She's speaking truth that the show itself has been demonstrating for years, and Peter is all these things she's describing. The show has played his terrible behavior for laughs for hundreds of episodes, but Meg strips away the comedy and makes everyone confront what Peter actually is when you remove the laugh track. Peter's delayed realization that these are criticisms rather than compliments is perfect character comedy, showing how oblivious he is, even to direct insults. When Peter turns to Lois for support, she refuses to back him up. Instead, Lois unleashes on Peter for not defending her when Meg attacked her. This triggers a chain reaction where Chris, Lois, and Peter turn on each other, revealing that Meg was just a scapegoat holding back their mutual hostility. Without Meg to focus their dysfunction on, they immediately start attacking each other with the same viciousness they usually reserve for her. Peter runs upstairs crying, unable to handle being criticized the way he criticizes everyone else. Lois follows him, and Chris leaves the room as well. Meg sits alone, reflecting on what she's unleashed. Brian, coming down from his mushroom trip, tells Meg she did the right thing by standing up for herself. He encourages her to hold firm and not back down now that she's finally spoken her truth. This is the perfect setup for Meg to actually break free from her family's abuse. She's exposed their dysfunction, shown them all their flaws, and reduced them to fighting among themselves. She has leverage now. She could set boundaries, demand better treatment, or follow through on her plan to leave when she turns 18. The episode has built to what should be Meg's liberation. Instead, Meg reaches a different conclusion. She realizes that her family needs someone to abuse. Without a target for their dysfunction, they turn on each other and fall apart. Her role as the family's lightning rod isn't just something that happens to her. It's functionally necessary for keeping her parents' marriage intact and preventing the whole family from destroying themselves. So Meg makes what the episode frames as a mature and selfless choice. She apologizes to everyone for standing up for herself and takes back everything she said. This ending is catastrophically bad for multiple reasons. First, it sends the message that abuse victims should accept abuse if refusing it would inconvenience their abusers. And Meg explicitly states that she's choosing to continue being her family's punching bag because they can't cope with their problems any other way. This isn't just a terrible message for fictional characters. It's potentially harmful to real people watching who might be in abusive family situations. Second, the ending completely wastes the emotional investment the episode built up. Viewers watching Meg finally stand up for herself felt catharsis at seeing years of abuse finally addressed, and having Meg immediately take it all back and return to her role as victim feels like the show is mocking its audience for caring about these characters or thinking the show might do something meaningful. Third, the ending reinforces rather than challenges the status quo. By the end of the episode, nothing has changed. Meg is still the family punching bag. Peter, Lois, and Chris haven't learned anything. The family dynamics that were so destructive 15 minutes ago are fully restored. Ash, with Meg having explicitly agreed to continue enduring abuse for the family's benefit. The episode acknowledges that the family is dysfunctional and abusive, then argues that maintaining this dysfunction is preferable to the family members actually addressing their problems. The episode ends with Stewie breaking the fourth wall to deliver a message about drug use, encouraging viewers to visit their local library to learn more about drugs, because there's probably a drug dealer behind the library. And this joke is meant to undercut any serious message the episode might have had, treating the whole thing as just another absurd Family Guy adventure, rather than a genuine attempt at emotional storytelling. Critical response to this episode was mixed, with many reviewers praising Meg's speech while condemning the ending. Kevin McFarlane of the AV Club gave the episode a D+, noting that shifting to a dramatic bottle episode felt far too little too late in the show's run. He wrote that nobody cares about any member of the Griffin family the way audiences care about well-developed characters, and that Family Guy had spent years going down the path of least resistance by joining the fan chorus of hatred for Meg, rather than trying to make her a valued character. Many viewers found the ending particularly troubling because it seemed to justify the years of Meg abuse the show had committed, rather than acknowledging that the show had been wrong to use Meg as a punching bag. The episode doubled down by having Meg herself explain why she needs to be abused. It's a defense mechanism for the writers, allowing them to continue the exact same patterns while claiming they've addressed the criticism. The episode also reveals a cynical understanding of how the Griffin family functions. The show essentially admits that Peter, Lois, and Chris are such terrible people that they need a designated victim, or else they'll destroy each other. But rather than using this revelation to suggest these characters should change, the episode argues that Meg should sacrifice herself to maintain their dysfunction. It's an acknowledgement that the family is irredeemably broken, with no intention of fixing the problem. Some defenders of the episode argue that it's actually a dark commentary on how abusive family dynamics work, and they suggest that Meg's choice to return to her role as scapegoat is meant to be seen as tragic rather than positive, showing how abuse victims get trapped in cycles they can't escape. However, this interpretation gives the episode more credit than it deserves, as there's no textual evidence that we're supposed to view Meg's choice as wrong. The episode treats it as Meg being mature and selfless, rather than as her being broken down by years of abuse. The episode's treatment of abuse as necessary for family stability is particularly problematic when you consider that many viewers might be experiencing similar dynamics in their own families. A young person being scapegoated by their family might watch this episode and internalize the message that they should accept this treatment, because speaking up will only make things worse. That's a genuinely harmful takeaway from an episode that seemed positioned to deliver the opposite message. The Brian subplot provides an interesting counterpoint to the main story. While Meg is dealing with her family's abuse, Brian is experiencing temporary insanity caused by drugs. His bad trip is something he'll recover from, with Stewie helping him through the worst of it until the drugs wear off. The parallel suggests that while Brian's suffering is temporary and chemical, Meg's suffering is permanent and self-imposed. Brian gets care and support during his crisis, and while Meg gets told to accept her situation for everyone else's benefit. The episode also demonstrates Family Guy's inability to maintain dramatic tone without undercutting it with comedy. The extended drug trip sequences, the absurd jokes, and the fourth wall-breaking ending all serve to remind viewers that this is just a silly cartoon, rather than a serious examination of family dysfunction. But the episode wanted to be taken seriously during Meg's speeches, so creating tonal whiplash that prevents it from succeeding as either comedy or drama. What makes this episode particularly frustrating is that it demonstrates the writers understand Meg's situation perfectly well. They can articulate exactly what's wrong with how the family treats her. They can show the emotional damage it causes. They can make viewers feel genuine sympathy for Meg and anger at her abusers. Having done all that, and they consciously chose to restore the abusive status quo rather than allow any meaningful change. The episode has become somewhat mimetic online, with Meg's line, "You guys always act like you're better than me," becoming a template for various comparisons. The image of the family suddenly wearing fancy clothes when Meg calls them out has been used to make jokes about media criticism and cultural hierarchies. This mimetic afterlife is probably the episode's most positive legacy, and as it at least allows Meg's moment of defiance to live on independent of the disappointing ending. Years later, the episode remains controversial among fans. Some view it as one of the show's better attempts at character development, despite the problematic ending. Others see it as exemplifying everything wrong with how Family Guy handles serious topics. The debate over whether the ending ruins the episode or adds complex tragedy continues, and though the negative reception generally outweighs positive assessments. The episode's original air date was actually delayed by several weeks because it was supposed to air in May 2011 as part of a crossover event with The Cleveland Show and American Dad. However, a series of devastating tornadoes in the southern United States killed nearly 300 people, and Fox decided that airing episodes about a hurricane so soon after this tragedy would be insensitive, and the episodes were pushed to the following season, which meant Seahorse Seashell Party ultimately aired in October 2011 rather than its original date. This delay didn't affect the content, but does provide context for how networks think about sensitive content. Fox pulled episodes about a fictional hurricane out of respect for real tornado victims, showing corporate sensitivity to tragedy and suffering. Yet the same network had no problem airing an episode that portrayed domestic abuse victims as needing to accept their abuse. Suggesting corporate concern for sensitivity is highly selective. The episode represents a missed opportunity for Family Guy to evolve beyond using Meg as an easy punching bag. The show had the chance to acknowledge that this comedy device had run its course and wasn't funny anymore. Instead, it doubled down and tried to justify continuing the same pattern. And the episode essentially admits that the Meg abuse is wrong while arguing it should continue, which is somehow worse than never addressing the issue at all. Turban Cowboy. The episode that predicted a tragedy. In March 2013, Family Guy aired an episode that included a seemingly random cutaway gag involving Peter Griffin driving a car through the Boston Marathon, running over participants. The joke was typical Family Guy dark humor at making light of violence in an absurd scenario that viewers understood wasn't meant to be taken seriously. But then, barely 1 month later, 2 bombs exploded at the actual Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and injuring hundreds more. Suddenly, a throwaway joke became grotesquely prophetic, and an episode that would have faded into the show's vast catalogue became one of the most controversial things Family Guy ever produced. The episode itself, titled Turban Cowboy, deals with Peter befriending a Muslim man and accidentally becoming involved with a terrorist cell. This premise alone was controversial, touching on sensitive stereotypes about Muslims and terrorism in post-9/11 America. The episode attempted to satirize ignorance and prejudice while also making jokes that relied on those same stereotypes for humor. It's a difficult balance that Family Guy often struggles with, and this episode was no exception. Peter meets his new Muslim friend at a local establishment, and they bond over shared interests. The episode makes some effort to show that prejudice against Muslims is wrong, and that Peter's new friend is a normal person who happens to practice Islam. However, the plot also involves Peter accidentally joining what turns out to be a terrorist organization, playing into exactly the kind of stereotypes about Muslims that the episode claims to be criticizing. And this kind of contradictory messaging is common in Family Guy, where the show wants credit for being progressive while still making jokes that rely on regressive stereotypes. The marathon scene in question is a typical Family Guy cutaway gag, completely disconnected from the main plot. Peter is explaining something and says a line that triggers a flashback to "that time I ran the Boston Marathon," or similar setup language. The show cuts away to show Peter in a car and driving through crowded streets during the Boston Marathon. He deliberately swerves to hit runners, with the joke being Peter's callousness and the absurdity of someone treating a marathon as an obstacle course to drive through. Bodies fly, people scream, and Peter continues driving with a satisfied expression. It's meant to be so over the top and unrealistic that viewers laugh at the absurdity rather than being disturbed by the violence. This kind of cartoon violence has been Family Guy's stock in trade for years. The show features characters dying in ridiculous ways, people getting horrifically injured for comedic effect, and scenarios that would be traumatic in real life treated as punchlines. The Boston Marathon gag fit this pattern perfectly. It was violence rendered so cartoonish and disconnected from reality that it became absurd rather than disturbing. The scene lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and most viewers probably forgot about it minutes after it aired. Then came April 15th, 2013. 2 pressure cooker bombs exploded near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. detonating about 12 seconds apart. The blasts killed 3 people immediately, including an 8-year-old boy. Hundreds more were injured, with 17 people losing limbs. The explosions shattered what should have been a celebration of athletic achievement and community, turning the marathon finish line into a scene of carnage and chaos. The images from that day showed bloodied runners, spectators with catastrophic injuries, and first responders desperately trying to help the wounded. It was a genuine tragedy that traumatized an entire city and shocked the nation. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, some viewers remembered the Family Guy episode that had aired just weeks earlier. Suddenly, that throwaway gag about Peter driving through the marathon seemed disturbingly prescient. Social media exploded with discussions about the episode, with some people claiming Family Guy had somehow predicted or even inspired the attack. These accusations were amplified by edited videos that spliced together the marathon scene with other violent content from the episode to make it appear even worse than it was. And these hoax videos were particularly damaging because they created false narratives about what the original episode contained. One widely shared edit combined the marathon scene with a completely separate scene involving a cell phone and terrorism from a different part of the episode, making it look like the show had specifically depicted the Boston Marathon bombing. This wasn't what the original episode showed, but the edited version spread far more widely than corrections, and leading many people to believe Family Guy had been far more specifically prophetic than it actually was. Fox immediately pulled the episode from rotation and removed it from streaming platforms. The episode disappeared from syndication, online streaming services, and future broadcasts. For years, it was impossible to watch Turban Cowboy through any official channel, as if the episode had never existed. This blackout lasted for approximately 9 years, with the episode only returning to Hulu in September 2022, nearly a decade after the bombing. Seth MacFarlane addressed the controversy directly, expressing regret that a joke from one of his shows inadvertently connected to a real tragedy. He was careful to note that the episode was created months before the bombing with no way to predict that such an attack would occur. The timing was purely coincidental, but that didn't make the juxtaposition any less uncomfortable. And MacFarlane defended the show's right to make dark jokes, but acknowledged that this particular joke had aged terribly in retrospect. The controversy raised difficult questions about comedy, tragedy, and coincidence. Should creators be held responsible when their jokes coincidentally mirror real tragedies? The episode was written and animated months before the bombing, making it impossible for the creators to have known what would happen. The joke wasn't specifically about terrorism or bombs at the marathon. It was just Peter being violent and careless in a random location that happened to be the Boston Marathon. Yet the coincidence felt too close to dismiss entirely. Critics of the censorship argued that pulling the episode gave it more power than it deserved. The scene lasted seconds and had nothing to do with the actual bombing. By treating it as too offensive to air, Fox was essentially validating the idea that coincidental similarities between fiction and tragedy are grounds for censorship. This sets a dangerous precedent where any fictional violence could become unacceptable retroactively if similar violence occurs in real life. Others argued that Fox made the right call by prioritizing sensitivity to victims over abstract principles about censorship. The Boston Marathon bombing was recent and raw, with survivors still dealing with physical and psychological trauma. Allowing an episode that depicted violence at the marathon, regardless of context or intent, felt disrespectful to those victims. Even if the episode didn't actually predict or influence the attack, Watching cartoon violence at the marathon could be genuinely traumatizing for people affected by the real violence. The hoax videos that splice together different scenes deserve particular attention because they demonstrate how misinformation spreads faster than truth. The edited versions showed content that never appeared in the actual episode, creating false memories in people who saw the edits but never watched the original. Even after the hoaxes were debunked, many people continued to believe Family Guy had somehow depicted the bombing in more specific detail than it actually had, and these false beliefs persist years later, showing how difficult it is to correct misinformation once it takes hold. The episode's treatment of Muslim characters and terrorism themes also came under renewed scrutiny after the bombing. The Tsarnaev brothers who carried out the attack were Muslim, and their radicalization became a major focus of post-bombing analysis. This made the episode's stereotypical portrayal of Muslim terrorists seem even more problematic in retrospect. What might have been questionable satire became deeply uncomfortable content that seemed to validate prejudices about Muslims rather than challenging them. The ban also affected Seth MacFarlane's other shows that were part of the same crossover event. American Dad and The Cleveland Show had episodes that were part of the same Night of the Hurricane theme, and while those episodes didn't contain anything as directly relevant to the bombing, they were initially pulled alongside the Family Guy episode. The crossover event was meant to be a promotional stunt showing MacFarlane's dominance of Fox's animation lineup, but instead it became a liability that the network tried to erase. The timing of the episode's return to streaming in 2022 raised questions about when enough time had passed for the episode to be acceptable again. 9 years after the bombing, as some survivors had moved on with their lives while others still struggled with trauma. There wasn't a clear moment when the episode transformed from too sensitive to acceptable. The decision to restore it seemed to be based on the passage of time, rather than any specific milestone or change in public sentiment. The episode's banning and eventual restoration created a situation where Turban Cowboy became more notorious than it otherwise would have been. If the bombing had never happened, and this would have been just another controversial Family Guy episode that offended some viewers and entertained others before disappearing into the show's archive. The bombing made it infamous, transforming a forgettable cutaway gag into a cultural moment that people still reference and debate years later. This episode also highlighted how differently society treats animated comedy versus other forms of media. Live-action shows that had depicted fictional terrorist attacks at public gatherings didn't face the same scrutiny or censorship, even though their scenarios might have been equally close to real attacks. There seems to be a lower tolerance for animated shows dealing with sensitive content, perhaps because animation is still associated with children's content, despite shows like Family Guy being aimed at adults. The Boston Marathon bombing's impact on this episode demonstrates the unpredictable nature of offense and controversy. The creators couldn't have anticipated the tragedy, and the joke itself wasn't particularly notable before the bombing occurred. It became controversial not because of its content, but because of circumstances completely beyond anyone's control. This makes it different from episodes that were controversial from the moment they aired because of intentional creative choices, and the episode's legacy is complicated by the distance between what it actually depicted and what people remember it depicting. The marathon scene was brief and non-specific, showing cartoon violence without detail about how the violence occurred. It wasn't about terrorism, bombs, or targeting a specific event, but people's memories of the episode are colored by the real bombing, making the scene seem more detailed and offensive than it actually was. For Family Guy as a show, Turban Cowboy represents a unique entry in its catalogue of controversy. Most controversial episodes offend through intentional choices about content and humour. This episode became controversial through coincidence, showing that sometimes the biggest controversies come from factors completely outside creators' control. The show couldn't have predicted that a silly cutaway gag would become tragically relevant weeks later, and the question of whether the episode should have been pulled remains debatable. On one hand, the network showed sensitivity to a genuine tragedy and avoided causing additional pain to victims. On the other hand, the censorship gave disproportionate importance to a brief scene that had nothing to do with the actual attack. Both positions have merit, and the lack of clear right answer is part of what makes this controversy so interesting. The marathon scene itself, and when watched today with full context, is still just a throwaway gag about cartoon violence. It doesn't become more offensive or meaningful just because a real tragedy happened later. But the emotional weight of the real bombing makes it impossible to watch the scene without thinking about actual victims, real violence, and genuine suffering. The coincidence created an association that can never be fully separated, even for viewers who understand that the connection is entirely superficial. And this episode serves as a reminder that comedy exists in specific cultural and temporal contexts. A joke that seems harmless one week can become offensive the next, based on factors completely outside the joke itself. The challenge for creators is that they can't predict what events might retroactively make their content problematic. All they can do is try to be thoughtful about what they create and hope that coincidences don't transform comedy into unintended commentary on tragedy. Fresh Air, the incestuous marriage. Nobody asked for Among Family. Guy's many controversial episodes, few have generated as much universal disgust as Fresh Air, the season 12 episode where Peter attempts to marry his 14-year-old son Chris to gain access to an inheritance. The episode manages to combine incest, pedophilia, financial exploitation, and strained homophobia into a single plot that offended viewers across the political spectrum. Even by Family Guy standards, and where pushing boundaries is the point, this episode crossed lines that left audiences wondering how it ever got approved. The episode begins with a relatively innocent premise. Chris asks his father to spend time with him, specifically wanting to go fishing together, as they've apparently been discussing. Peter bluntly refuses, telling Chris he was lying about wanting to spend time together just to get Chris to leave him alone. This establishes Peter as an actively neglectful father, and not just someone who gets distracted, but someone who deliberately deceives his son about caring about their relationship. It's harsh, but consistent with Peter's established character as a terrible parent. When Carter Pewterschmidt breaks his leg and needs someone to care for him while Barbara is out of town, the responsibility falls to Chris after Lois can't do it, and Meg refuses. During this time, Chris and his grandfather bond genuinely. Chris teaches Carter about modern technology, who shows him how to order pizza online and helps him form a garage band. More disturbingly, Chris also teaches Carter about masturbation by giving him a handjob, which the episode presents as a generous act rather than as the inappropriate sexual contact it actually represents. Carter explicitly confirms this is what happened, making it clear this wasn't euphemistic but literal. The Carter-Chris relationship starts sweetly enough in other respects. Chris isn't trying to get anything from his grandfather. He's genuinely enjoying spending time with an elder family member who appreciates him. When Carter tries to pay Chris for his help, Chris refuses the money, explaining that he helped because he wanted to, not because he expected compensation. This humble and genuine attitude impresses Carter so much that he decides to change his will to make Chris his sole heir. This is where Peter's interest activates. Throughout the episode, Peter has shown zero interest in Chris as a person. He actively avoided spending time with his son and deceived him about their relationship. But the moment Peter learns that Chris will inherit Carter's fortune, suddenly Peter wants to be Chris's best friend. The transformation is instantaneous and transparently self-serving, but Peter assumes Chris is too naive to see through it. Peter's attempts to win Chris's affection start out awkward and escalate to disturbing. He dresses in Chris's clothes to try to relate to teenage interests. He pretends to like the same things Chris likes. He takes Chris to events and activities that Chris might enjoy. All of this is manipulative, but not yet beyond the pale. Peter is treating Chris as a means to an end, rather than as a person worthy of love. But at least he's not doing anything that would be criminal if discovered. Then Peter's plan evolves into something far more problematic. He decides that the best way to ensure access to Chris's inheritance is to marry him. The episode tries to frame this through the lens of gay marriage being legal in Vermont, making it technically possible for a man to marry another man. But the joke falls apart immediately because this isn't actually about gay marriage. It's about a father attempting to marry his underage son for money, which is incest, pedophilia, financial exploitation, and about 12 other things that should be illegal everywhere. The episode includes a scene where Peter tricks Lois into divorcing him so he'll be free to marry Chris. Lois eventually figures out what Peter is planning and tries to stop him. But by then, Peter and Chris are already on their way to Vermont. The fact that Peter has to divorce his wife to marry his son highlights how completely this plan breaks every social, legal, and moral boundary that exists. And what makes this plot particularly gross is that Peter appears to be physically attracted to Chris, not just financially interested in him. There are shots of Peter staring at Chris's body. Peter takes Chris on romantic dates to candlelit restaurants. They hold hands. Peter proposes with Lois's ring. The episode includes all the trappings of a romantic courtship, rather than just a financial arrangement. While Peter's primary motivation is money, the episode consistently implies that he's willing to consummate this relationship if that's what it takes to access the inheritance. Chris, for his part, seems aware that Peter is marrying him for money, but doesn't care. He explicitly states that he knows Peter's motivation, but appreciates spending time with his father, regardless of the ulterior motive. This reveals how starved Chris is for parental attention, that he'll accept even flagrantly manipulative interest as better than being ignored. It's genuinely sad that Chris values time with his father so little that he'll accept his father literally marrying him, if that's the only way to get attention. The wedding scene arrives, with Peter and Chris standing at the altar in Vermont, preparing to make their union legal. Lois bursts in to object, bringing the rest of the family along to stop this travesty. She tells Peter he cannot marry his son, that this is wrong on every conceivable level. But Chris stops Lois and explains his reasoning. He knew all along that Peter was marrying him for money, but he didn't care because planning the wedding meant spending more time with his father than they ever had before. He says that if being married means continuing to spend time with Peter, then it's worth it. This moment attempts to be emotionally resonant, showing Chris's desperate need for parental love and Peter's realization that he's been a terrible father. And Peter apologizes and asks Chris to be his son again instead of his husband. They hug, the family goes home, and everything returns to normal. The episode tries to frame this as Peter learning a lesson about priorities and family values, but the lesson seems to be merely that you shouldn't marry your son, which is a pretty low bar for character growth. The episode received universally negative reviews. The AV Club gave it a D grade, and with reviewer Eric Thurm noting that the frequent incest jokes drag everything down into the depths of comedy and decency hell. He acknowledged that a decent episode of Family Guy was buried somewhere in this premise, but that the execution of the incest plot overwhelmed everything else. Most critics agreed that the episode's central premise was so off-putting that no amount of good jokes or clever writing could redeem it. Fans also responded negatively, and with many calling it one of the worst Family Guy episodes ever made. Online discussion forums filled with people expressing disgust at what they'd just watched. Even viewers who typically defended Family Guy's controversial content found this episode indefensible. The combination of incest, inappropriate content involving a minor, and the generally unfunny treatment of the whole situation alienated nearly everyone. The episode's treatment of gay marriage also drew criticism for framing it as something that enables inappropriate relationships. By having Peter use Vermont's gay marriage law as a loophole to marry his son, the episode implies that legal gay marriage creates dangerous possibilities that should concern people. This is actually an argument that opponents of gay marriage made during debates about legalization, claiming that allowing same-sex marriage would lead to people trying to marry relatives or children. The episode inadvertently gives credence to these fears by using gay marriage laws as the mechanism for Peter's scheme. Several plot holes and continuity errors make the episode even worse. Peter claims he needs to go to Vermont because gay marriage is legal there, but a previous episode established that Brian got gay marriage legalized in Quahog. If this were true, Peter wouldn't need to travel to another state. The episode ignores its own show's continuity to make its plot work. Additionally, Vermont's gay marriage law obviously doesn't permit marriages between parents and children, or marriages involving minors, so Peter's scheme shouldn't have been legal even in the episode's fictional universe. The episode includes a cutaway gag referencing Chris Chan, and the internet personality, who years later would be arrested for having sexual relations with their elderly mother. While this wasn't known at the time the episode aired in 2014, the coincidence is deeply uncomfortable in retrospect. The episode's main plot is literally about inappropriate sexual relationships between family members, and it includes a reference to someone who would later be revealed to have committed similar acts, and this gives the episode an even more disturbing quality when viewed with hindsight. The episode also features a scene revealing that Chris and Meg take baths together, with implications that their relationship might be inappropriate as well. This gratuitous addition of potential sibling incest on top of the parent-child incest feels like the episode trying to be as shocking as possible, without considering whether shock value alone makes for good comedy. And it's the kind of boundary pushing that feels like it's trying too hard to be edgy, rather than actually having something meaningful or funny to say. What makes this episode particularly frustrating is that the emotional core could have worked in a different story. Chris desperately wants his father's attention and will accept almost any behavior from Peter if it means spending time together. This is genuinely sad, and could have been the basis for a meaningful episode about neglectful parenting and children's need for validation. Instead, the show wraps this potentially touching element in so many layers of inappropriate content that the emotional truth gets lost entirely. The episode's ending suggests that Peter has learned to value Chris as a son, But nothing in Peter's future behavior confirms this lesson stuck. Subsequent episodes show Peter continuing to neglect Chris, ignore his needs, and treat him as an afterthought. The episode's conclusion rings hollow because the show immediately forgets it and returns to its established patterns. This makes the entire episode feel pointless, as if they went through all this controversial content without any lasting impact. For a show that prides itself on pushing boundaries and refusing to acknowledge topics as off-limits, this episode found one of the few boundaries that most viewers agreed shouldn't be crossed. The combination of elements, father-son incest, sexual content involving a minor, using gay marriage as a plot device for inappropriate relationships, and the generally unfunny execution created something that didn't work on any level. It wasn't provocative in an interesting way. It wasn't funny enough to justify the offensive content. It just made viewers uncomfortable without providing enough entertainment value to make the discomfort worthwhile. And the episode also demonstrates the difference between provocative comedy and comedy that exists merely to shock. Provocative comedy uses offensive or controversial elements to make a point, challenge assumptions, or create meaningful reactions beyond simple shock. This episode just throws offensive content at the audience without having much to say about any of it. The incest plot doesn't satirize anything or illuminate any truth. It's just gross for the sake of being gross. And looking at the episode years later, it's hard to understand how this premise made it through the entire creative process without someone raising concerns. Multiple writers, animators, voice actors, and executives had to approve this episode at various stages. At no point did anyone apparently suggest that having Peter try to marry his teenage son might be going too far. This raises questions about the culture of the show's writer's room and what ideas get shot down if this one made it through. The legacy of this episode is that it's consistently ranked among the worst Family Guy episodes and is frequently cited as an example of when the show's boundary pushing becomes counterproductive. It didn't generate the kind of cultural controversy that bans episodes or creates national conversations. Instead, it produced a more damaging consensus. People just thought it was bad, not controversial in an interesting way, not offensive in a meaningful way. Just poorly conceived and badly executed television. Conclusion: the legacy of controversy and the limits of comedy Family Guy has spent over 2 decades testing the boundaries of what animated television can depict and which topics comedy can address. The episodes examined here represent moments when those tests failed, when pushing boundaries created content that offended, disturbed, or disappointed audiences in ways that went beyond the show's typical controversies. Each episode illuminates different aspects of what makes comedy controversial and reveals the complex relationship between artistic freedom, social responsibility, and entertainment value. The banned abortion episode shows how some topics remain so politically charged that networks won't air content about them, regardless of quality or perspective. The domestic violence episode demonstrates how attempts to address serious issues can backfire when the creators don't fully understand those issues. The transgender episode reveals how representation can cause harm when it relies on stereotypes and misinformation. The Meg abuse episode illustrates the disappointing results when shows acknowledge their problems but refuse to actually change. The Boston Marathon episode proves that even innocuous content can become controversial through coincidence and tragic circumstances. The incestuous marriage episode exemplifies the difference between provocative comedy and content that shocks without purpose. These episodes collectively tell a story about the evolution of Family Guy from an irreverent boundary pusher to a show that sometimes struggles to understand which boundaries deserve to be pushed and which exist for good reasons. They show a series that wants credit for addressing serious topics while maintaining its reputation for offensive humor, and often failing to satisfy either goal. They demonstrate that not all publicity is good publicity, and that some controversies damage a show's reputation rather than enhancing it. The inconsistent approach across these episodes is particularly notable. Some tried to be serious and failed through misunderstanding their subjects. Others attempted to be shocking and failed through lack of substance behind the shock. Still others became controversial through circumstances beyond the creator's control. And there's no single explanation for why these episodes generated such strong negative reactions, which makes it difficult to derive simple lessons about what comedy should or shouldn't do. What these episodes do establish is that there are limits to what audiences will accept, even from a show built on transgression. Those limits aren't fixed or universal. They vary by topic, by execution, by cultural context, and by individual viewer sensibilities. But they exist, and when a show crosses them, and the backlash can be severe enough to get episodes banned, remove them from streaming platforms, or simply earn such negative reception that they're remembered as failures rather than as controversial successes. Family Guy continues to air new episodes, continuing to push boundaries and occasionally generating controversy. The show has proven remarkably resilient, surviving cancellations, boycotts, and public outcry to remain a fixture of television comedy. But the episodes discussed here serve as reminders that even a show built on offensive humor can go too far, and that there's a difference between being provocatively funny and being controversially bad. For fans and critics alike, these episodes provide insight into the creative risks of animated comedy and the dangers of assuming that shock value alone creates worthwhile content. They remind us that representation matters, that context is crucial, and that comedy carries responsibility even as it seeks to provoke and challenge. Most importantly, they demonstrate that the conversation about what comedy can and should do remains ongoing, shaped by each new episode that tests boundaries and each audience reaction that redefines where those boundaries lie. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more deep dives into the most controversial moments in animation history.